Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Josh Vickers, and I am with RTI International's Forensic Technology Center of Excellence. I will be your host and moderator for today's webinar. We have quite a large crowd today. Today's webinar is titled SWGDAM Recommendations for Reporting Likelihood Ratios. We do have 4 presenters for today's webinar. The first I'd like to introduce is Mr. Sean Monpetit. He was the chair of the Scientific Working Group on DNA Analysis Methods, also known as SWGDAM, working group on verbal scale recommendations for reporting likelihood ratios. Mr. Monpetit has participated in SWGDAM since 2014 and currently serves on SWGDAM's executive board as well as the Autosomal DNA Interpretation Subcommittee. He is currently employed as the DNA Technical Manager of the San Diego Police Department Crime Laboratory and has served in that capacity since 2006. He has been employed with the San Diego Police Department for 19 years and has 21 years of experience in the field of forensic DNA analysis. Our next presenter is Dr. Tamara Moretti. She is a research biologist for the DNA support unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Laboratory. She earned her PhD in genetics from the George Washington University for her research at the National Institutes of Health to identify genetic variants for linkage studies of disease susceptibility loci. 22 years ago, Dr. Moretti joined the FBI Forensic Science Research Unit, where she performed research, development, and validation of PCR-based methods for the analysis of nuclear and mitochondrial DNA. She has lectured extensively and trained forensic scientists and attorneys throughout the U.S. and internationally. At the FBI, Dr. Moretti has also held positions as an examiner in casework and convicted offender databasing operations, and has managed the FBI's DNA training and validation program. Stephen Myers is another one of our presenters today. He was a member of the SWGDAM Working Group on Verbal Scale Recommendations for reporting likelihood ratios. He has participated in SWGDAM since 2008 and OSAC since 2015. He has been employed for 27 years by the California Department of Justice Jan Bashinki DNA Laboratory, primarily working in the casework and method development sections, as well as teaching through the California Criminalistics Institute. He has 29 years of experience in the field of forensic serology and DNA analysis. And our last introductee and first presenter of today is Ms. Geraldine Conway. She has been a member of the SWGDAM Working Group on Verbal Scale Recommendations for Reporting Likelihood Ratios and has participated in SWGDAM since 2010 and currently serves on the Autosomal DNA Interpretation Subcommittee. Ms. Conway has been with the FBI laboratory since 2000 and has been a forensic examiner since 2004. And is currently the legal program manager in the DNA casework unit, where she keeps current on legal challenges to DNA testing. She holds a Master's of Science in Molecular Biology from New Mexico State University and a Bachelor's of Science in Genetics from Texas A&M University. We'll go ahead and go through our disclaimer real quick. The opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. Any products and manufacturers discussed are presented for informational purposes only and do not constitute product approval or endorsement by the U.S. Department of Justice. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand things over to our first presenter of the day, Ms. Geraldine Conway.
Hi, so I'm Geraldine Conway and a caseworker in the FBI laboratory, and I was just going to start us off by letting you know what it was that we worked on and how we got to our final recommendations for reporting likelihood ratios. Like Josh, I also have a disclaimer because it's the FBI, and what would we be without disclaimers? So the names of commercial manufacturers that we're providing are for identification purposes only, and inclusion does not imply endorsement by the FBI of the manufacturer or its products or services. The views are expressed are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the FBI or the U.S. government. So I wanted to start out with where we started. SWGDAM had received a number of inquiries that were regarding verbal scales as these labs were transitioning to using likelihood ratios if they hadn't before. And the questions that came to us were things like, well, can we use one? Should we even use one? And which one, if we're going to use one, should we use? And they were looking for guidance from SWGDAM for our recommendations as to whether or not a universal verbal scale could be recommended. So an ad hoc working group was put together, which was comprised of experts in statistics as well as forensic practitioners. And these were people with expertise in interpretation of mixed samples and in probabilistic genotyping. We had to determine whether we could even recommend using a verbal scale, and if we did, can we agree on a recommended scale that we could all agree on? We wanted to determine if exclusions were appropriately reported when we had likelihood ratio results that were less than 1 but were still some very small value. So could we come up with basically an exclusion zone? And then finally, we wanted to discuss the term inconclusive and whether we should apply a term like that to likelihood ratios results when they didn't equal 1. So where did we start? Well, first we started with what we could find in the publications for verbal scales. One thing that you'll note in these is that only with the actual value of 1 did we have a result that was no assistance, which is over here. However, many of these scales didn't have any results any recommendations when those values were less than 1. So we didn't see inconclusive zones in the published scales, but we felt that, well, maybe we were doing something different, and so we did a survey of the laboratories that we could get information from. So some of these laboratories had very granular scales. Some had very simplistic scales, so they didn't have very many levels in their scales. Some actually had no degrees of support at all. Basically, they didn't use a scale. They just said, hey, in this range we have support for the inclusionary hypothesis, and in a different range we have support for the exclusionary hypothesis. We did see inconclusive zones in the initial review of scales that we were looking at, and we also started to see degrees of HD support. So we started to see these, what I would call a mirror image scale, where we have degrees of support for HD. We had another group of scales that we looked at that had they had exclusion zones. So they didn't use degrees of HD support. They just found a level at which they declared an exclusion zone. We also saw that there were a number that had inconclusive zones that some were wide and some were quite narrow. And finally, the maximum you'd see was either very strong or extremely strong that you would see. We looked at some other scales that actually had qualifiers that would be dependent on the number of contributors that were looked at. So if we had a large number of contributors where we know that the data was more ambiguous, then we would have a larger inconclusive zone, and we would have smaller inconclusive zones when the number of contributors was lower. So finally, sort of putting all these together, the ad hoc group, when we were looking at our verbal scales, we had some that were we all had inconclusive zones, and we had some that sort of fell in the whole range. We had mirror images, we had granular, we had exclusion zones, and so what we wanted to do was determine what we needed. Well, what information did we need research-wise to determine what a good recommended scale would be? So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tamara Moretti, also from the FBI laboratory, and she's going to review the research that we needed to develop this verbal scale.
Okay, thank you, Geraldine, and welcome, and thank you everyone for your interest in understanding the recommendations that we have made from SWGDAM. So to supplement what Geraldine had said, on our committee, we had representatives or folks that had been calculating and communicating likelihood ratios. A couple of us have been working with LRs for several decades. And then the rest of us, we had experience through our validation studies, through developing standard operating procedures, through training people in our own laboratories and communicating these results to stakeholders and in the courts. So we were able to bring our experience together for what we were encountering with the reception of the likelihood ratios and our challenges in communicating those results. And based on what you've seen from Geralyn's summary of the different laboratories' verbal scales, it's evident that depending on where you were, the same mixture in one laboratory might have been called moderate evidence, moderate support, whereas in another laboratory that may be called inconclusive, or something that was strong evidence, was extremely strong evidence in another laboratory. So one of our goals was try to, for one, we would certainly hope that within our same laboratory that we would be expressing the weight of the evidence in similar manners, and then ideally amongst the different laboratories in the community that we would be describing the same evidence in the same way. We've worked very hard to understand what the likelihood ratio means and how to accurately convey that when we're talking about the value, and that's going to be a topic that Stephen is going to be presenting in our last talk about how do we properly communicate this. But some of the challenges can come into play when we're trying to articulate what those results mean and answer questions about them in court. So with our experience, we thought perhaps we can get some guidance or perspective to address this issue by looking at our validation studies. And in these validation studies, those of you who've conducted them are very familiar with the one that I'm showing on the screen. And what we do with these types of studies is that we have specificity studies and sensitivity studies. So we've created mixtures where we know the ground truth. We know who is and is not a contributor to the mixture. And then we will test our mixtures with the non-contributors and hope that we get exclusionary support or a likelihood ratio value less than 1 that would address how specific is the software and the modeling for addressing the testing of the non-contributors. And then the sensitivity studies, on the other hand, are ones in which we test true contributors, and we would expect that, or would hope that those tests would generate likelihood ratios that are greater than 1. Now, these particular studies don't necessarily explicitly dictate something that tells you how can you describe the weight of the evidence, but we thought we would look to these particular results, these particular studies, and see if there's some information or guidance that we could gain from them. So in the ideal scenario, we would have non-contributor testing on the scale here going from an LR of 0 to 1 to over 1 million, that we would have non-contributors giving results less than 1 with increasing support in this direction towards 0, and then true contributors would give results greater than 1, increasing support in the direction going to the right. So that's the ideal scenario. So let's first talk about the non-contributor testing. And one of the important things to appreciate about non-contributor testing, when we have a mixture, certainly if you were to continue to simulate or test additional non-contributor profiles, that eventually, if you test enough profiles, you will encounter one that, if you will, fits within the mixture and would incorrectly turn inclusionary support. And that's just a basic principle of genetics, that if we have the appropriate alleles and the appropriate peak height ratios and so forth, that we would eventually perhaps find a non-contributor that would match, if you will, in the mixture. This is showing the FBI's specificity testing for global filer, where we evaluated 2, 3, and 4 person mixtures. And we're looking at first our non-contributor testing. So in our mixture set where we tested, I don't remember the exact number, but it's approaching about 400 mixtures. For our non-contributor testing, about 60% of the non-contributors generated in star mix a value that is truncated or rounded or it's actually 0. And that we would consider an exclusion. And then along the scale here where we are approaching 1, we had various levels of support for the defense proposition. And here's an inconclusive or an uninformative LR of 0 for some of the mixtures. And then we did have some non-contributors, a few of them, that provided support for the prosecution proposition. And note that the maximum adventitious or false HCP support for a non-contributor was 95. And why might this happen? Well, this is an example of an identifier plus mixture. It's a total of 1 nanogram of DNA, a 1 to 10 mixture, where both contributors' DNA is degraded. And I've shown with the box here where we can actually see minor contributor peaks. There was one non-contributor where we have minor contributor peaks. Sorry, I'm struggling with the cursor here. We have minor contributor peaks. Give me 1 second to recover that. Minor contributor peaks that represent or consistent with this non-contributor. We have non-contributor alleles that would have been masked by a major contributor. And then there are some instances where we see a peak that matches, but this other peak of the non-contributor could be explained by dropout or stutter. And over here on the right, the non-contributor for the high molecular weight alleles, there appears to be locus dropout of that particular contributor. And this gave an HPD-LR of 862, supporting the prosecution proposition or exclusionary support for the non-contributor. And the only thing in this particular profile that didn't match up exactly with this non-contributor was this one peak here, which could be modeled as a 9% stutter peak. What kinds of data results in this adventitious HP support for a non-contributor? Well, this is the same data represented in 3 different ways for these adventitious HP support results. And generally, we're talking about total, the contributor contributions of less than 50 picograms. We have very low average peak height and extensive allele dropout. In this particular assessment, a peak that had dropped out was given a peak height of half the analytical threshold. So that's how we get these very, very low values for these results. And there were 0 to 4 obligate alleles. And by obligate, I'm referring to an allele that is unique to that contributor in the mixture and it's unshared with others. And so there were very few obligate alleles. And note as well that these adventitious supports, and this example, which by the way is identifier plus data, all of those were less than 1 in 100. So let's now switch to true contributor testing. And here we have the true contributors where we get very high support values for the prosecution hypothesis, and then going all along the scale. So when we went back and looked at the mixtures that gave results in this area, if you look at those mixtures, we realized that we would, in analyzing the results right from the start, have excluded those known contributors because they were present in such very low levels. And in our laboratory, we would not run these types of mixtures in star mix. We would declare an exclusion outright. So I'm not really considering those in this assessment, but the ones where we would look at the mixture and not be sure, is that person included or not in the mixture, we would run those in star mix. And here we found that we falsely generated HD support for true contributors up to a maximum value or down to a maximum value of 1 over 826. And what kinds of data results in this incorrect HD support for a known contributor? Again, and it did not occur in our 2% global identifier plus mixtures, but they were low template amounts for the contributors, very extensive dropout, and very few alleles which were unique to that particular contributor. And the LRs were generally under 1,000, one over 1,000. And here they are combined as one in both of them. So you can note here that we've got this range from 1,000 to 100. And here everything is summarized. So one of the good news about the data set, and this of course is just based on our mixture. So another laboratory that generated different mixtures is going to generate different numbers than what we have here. But we're looking at our true contributor test where we would expect all of the results ideally to be over here, but we saw some contributors not supported for the present here, and then our uninformative values. And then here, the non-contributor tests generated, the most of them generated support for HD, with a small proportion generating uninformative likelihood ratios, and then a very small proportion of the non-contributors overall generating support for the prosecution hypothesis. So that, in our first protocol as we approached reporting these types of results, we at the FBI laboratory had defined this zone within which we had seen that there was a potential for false support, and we created that as the inconclusive zone. And in this zone, though, it doesn't mean that the LRs in this range are more likely or not to represent an incorrect proposition. Just because a value is in this particular range, it doesn't necessarily mean it's more likely to be incorrect. And I just present that as where our thinking was previously, and want you to know that based on our discussions with the SWGDAM group, our recommendation along these lines has changed. For me personally, one of the major things that impacted my opinion on the inconclusive results or inconclusive zone was this particular study by Dr. Joanne Bright of ESR, published in FSI Genetics in 2018. And I'll show you some of the details from this particular study. But the reason that Joe put the data together and conducted this study was in response to the PCAST report that was issued initially in 2016 and then the addendum in 2017. The information is here, and the report is out for anyone who's interested in knowing more about it. But in short, PCAST perceived limits to the proof of validity for probabilistic genotyping systems, and they felt that there were gaps with higher contributor numbers and mixture contributions less than 20%. They also stated that there were few studies that have explored 4- or 5-person mixtures, and those particular mixtures have involved very few sets of people, and in some cases, only one. They, however, limited themselves for this assessment of validity of the to empirical studies that were published in peer-reviewed scientific literature, and they incorrectly opined that there has been little empirical validation. And that is certainly true at the time of the published literature, but it's incorrect in terms of the data that exists in our community, largely as unpublished validation data, which is when Joe Bright stepped in and took the data from 31 laboratories that had validated StarMix, a number of STR amplification kits, a couple of different platforms for CE, and the data were all manually interpreted by the laboratories according to their SOPs, and a number of contributors were assigned, submitted as text files to ESR. We weren't concerned about 1- and 2-person mixtures based on the findings of, or the opinions of the PCAST group, but we focused particularly on 3 to 6 contributors in mixtures. The total number of mixtures was 2,825, and they were interpreted as having these numbers of contributors in proportions or quantities that you can see on the screen. So that's the data set, and then all of the data were reanalyzed in StarMix version 2.502 using the parameters that were specific to each and appropriate for each of those laboratories that generated the results. One thing to note, addressing PCAST concern about the inadequacy, the perceived inadequacy of mixture contributions less than 20%. What we're looking at here are essentially stacked bars of all 2825 mixtures. And what we see here on the left is essentially a 1-to-1-to-1 three-person mixture where you see fairly similar contributions. And then the mixture ratios change. And what we have here is an 8% contributor, an 8% contributor, and whatever the remainder is of that, because this is a 10-to-1-to-1 mixture. And the point that I want to make with this slide is that out of all of those mixtures, there were 2293 mixtures that had at least one contributor below 20% of the sample, making the point that we have thoroughly evaluated mixtures that are at these very low levels. And you can see their proportions across the mixtures here in the colors. Now, I wanted to take a moment to explain some of the plots that are in Dr. Bright's paper, and this is one for three-person mixtures. There are different representation of the data from what some of us are used to looking at, and the data are subdivided based on the average peak height. So over here we have an average peak height 0 to 50, and keep in mind again that dropped alleles were assigned a peak for this purpose, a peak height of half the analytical threshold. And this is the range 50 to 100 as the average peak height, going all the way up to 500 and greater. And what we are looking at here, these are density plots. So for example, if there were one result giving an LR at this level, a point would be made. But if there were several point estimates at this level, we see the density demonstrated through the width of these shapes. So what we want to look at for this discussion is the non-contributors. We have here the log LR of 0, which is an LR of 1, which is the uninformative range. So ideally, we would have all of these non-contributor areas occurring below this particular line. And in the next slide, I'm going to help a little bit by showing some colors here. What we have here is a range from essentially 1 to 100 on a log scale, on an LR scale, and then 100 to 10,000 represented in green. And the point that I want to make is depending on where we are with along this scale, and by the way, down here, these are the percentage of the tested mixtures that gave a LR of 0. But back to the point of the non-contributors, some of them are crossing over into HP support, into this lower range up to 100 and up to 10,000. And then I've tried to help show here with these these white triangles where the highest value was observed. And here we have the same for 4-person mixtures and then 5-person mixtures. So very similar results, but it changes somewhat based on the contributor number. So what for me personally was one of the important takeaways from this study is that there were 10,000 non-contributor profiles that were used in StarMix against all 2825 of these mixtures. And in total, that generated 28 million comparisons to non-contributors. So the slide here shows the top 5 are the highest LRs for the non-contributors that generated adventitious support for HP. And the point that I want to make is that the highest value was 500,000. This is a non-contributor that gave, as are the others, that gave support for the prosecution proposition. Now, one of the reasons that they gave this high level of support is that they share an incredibly high number of alleles with the known contributors to the mixtures, making the point here that if we were to consider low-level results, as I showed with our approach at the FBI, where our observed adventitious HP support, the highest one we observed being 95, if we were to create an inconclusive zone that's capped at that level, there will certainly be likelihood ratios that are greater or outside of that inconclusive zone. And depending on how many non-contributors that you test, you would expect the values to go even higher. So the inconclusive zone isn't actually giving us any cover, if you will, for addressing the potential for adventitious results, in that adventitious support for HP can certainly be generated outside of any zone of that nature that we would define based on our laboratory's validation studies. I wanted to share with you some quotes from John Buckleton's testimony on the matter. So when we have a non-contributor that generates support for HP, that is not an error. Adventitious support is in fact expected, and in my view, this is somewhat analogous to the situation that we're used to with common match probabilities. So for example, a CPI or an RMP of 1 in 50, we would certainly expect a number of people to also potentially match a mixture. And that's exactly what we're seeing with the testing that we're doing here with probabilistic genotyping. So Dr. Buckleton stated in his testimony, we've done some massive tests of false donors. There's 28 million tests, hundreds of millions, and we occasionally get a weak indication of inclusion at exactly the error rate expected from genetic principles. So they're not false positives by the software. They're false positives because in doing so many, we've actually replicated someone who is genetically similar to a true donor. The software StarMix has never made a false positive, but if we create a genotype that should be included, it is. So the software is actually performing as it should. So as my last slide in summary, I wanted to share with you another way of looking at the data from Dr. Bright's paper, the 28 million non-contributor tests. And we can basically break these results down into groupings of, shown here, essentially 2 to 100, and another factor of 100 shown here, another factor of 100, and then even greater there. And you can see here on the scale how we're going, increasing the numbers. Actually, I've put on the scale here. What I've done is tallied for you the LRs that provide adventitious HP support in the various ranges that I've shown here. So there were, of the total of adventitious HP support results from the 28 million tests, 98.25% of them, so the vast majority of them, occurred in this range from 2 to 99. So there was 1.75 remaining, and they occurred in the LR ranges that are shown here. Interestingly, 1.73 of the remainder is another 98% or 99%. So we have the greater majority of the results, the adventitious HP support occurring in this range, a few more here, and some but negligible or very few occurring in this range. And then we did not observe any adventitious HP support in this range. So these are some of the empirical data that were used or discussed by the ad hoc group in deciding what do LRs mean, what is the context of them, what is the significance of the statistical weight, and is there any way that we can use this information to help guide us and help give us ways in which we could communicate what an LR means. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Sean, who is going to now speak about the recommendations from SWGDAM.
Hey everybody, this is Sean, and I'm going to pick up this presentation if I can where Tamara left off. Essentially, I'd like to just kind of piggyback on what Geraldine and Tamara have said and kind of go through the recommendations. I think Geraldine did a great job of setting up sort of why the group was impaneled, and Tamara did a great job of explaining, some of the data that we looked at to help us determine what our recommendations from this group would be. And I'm just going to kind of go through, if I can, what the recommendations are and give you a little bit more background information on where those recommendations sort of came from. I'll give you a little insight into the discussions that the group had during our deliberations on this. So essentially, as Geraldine said, we were impaneled to look at the topic of reporting likelihood ratios and examining verbal scales. So the first thing that we did after getting this sort of marching orders from SWGDAM was to look for a group of people that we could use to form this group. Geraldine and Tamara both ran down sort of the expertise areas that members of the group had. And really, we started to have these discussions. And the first thing that we wanted to do was kind of gather information that was out there. So Geraldine mentioned that we gathered information on what verbal scales were out there and being used in the community, as well as which ones were published. And we wanted to also look at the literature. So we poured through some of the published articles that talked about presenting evidence, talked about using verbal scales, and just trying to give us a foundation from which we can have these discussions. Now, this slide that I've got on the screen right now is definitely not all-encompassing of the literature that's out there on the topic, but I think it is a good representation of publications out there that give a good idea about the salient points that we need to be thinking about when working on verbal scales. And in addition to this information, as Geraldine went through, we also used the published and unpublished verbal scales that were being used within the community to try and further our discussions. And as Geraldine kind of went over, we looked at these, and overall they were quite similar. The dividing factors were kind of small, basically differences in the terms that were used, especially on the lower magnitude LRs, differences in the terms slight, limited, weak, all of those were used. Differences in the numerical ranges that were also covered by these different terms. Some of the differences were based on the systems that were being used by the different laboratories. For instance, StarMix groups had LRs of 0 that were possible, and so they had exclusions that were possible when the LR was 0. Software packages like TrueAllele, I understand, do not give 0 LRs. They have a sort of cap on the LRs that you can get for each locus, so you don't get a 0. And so a lot of the labs that were using these have developed their verbal scales to kind of coincide with their software packages that they're using. And speaking about different software packages, the working group, our goal was to basically understand that likelihood ratios are used not only in probabilistic genotyping, but they're also used in binary interpretations as well. And even within probabilistic genotyping, there are both semi-continuous and continuous systems that can be used. And ultimately, the working group decided that we would try to be neutral with regards to the way in which the LR values were obtained. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter how the LR is obtained. Once you get an LR result and you've calculated a value, how you calculated that is really irrelevant to how that is reported and what you say about the meaning of the value of that LR. And ultimately, an LR is just an assessment of the probability of the evidence under 2 alternate explanations. And so with that in mind, we again, tried to remain sort of indifferent to how people were calculating their LRs. Another consideration that we wanted to be aware of while we were having these discussions is that likelihood ratios aren't unique to forensic DNA analysis, and they're not solely used for subsource or sub-subsource calculations. LRs are used in other disciplines, predominantly in Europe. They're used in trace evidence for a variety of different reasons, glass comparisons. I believe they're used for gunshot residue analysis. And even within the United States, I think other levels of propositions within the hierarchy of propositions are gaining traction. I'm aware of at least one training seminar that happened, I believe it was this week, that talked about activity level propositions. And so I think that, you know, it's important for, it was important for the working group as well as important for everyone else to recognize that even though, you know, most of us are doing DNA analysis and interpretations on a daily basis, this is concept of likelihood ratios is not narrowly construed to the field of forensic DNA analysis. It's a, you know, overarching statistical tool that is used in many different disciplines and many different fields. So we were trying to keep that in mind when we had our discussions as well. Some of the other considerations that the working group tried to keep in mind were that you know, a verbal scale is never intended to replace the value of the LR as a means of communicating the strength of the evidence. It's really just a tool that is used to assist or enhance the description of the strength of the evidence in order to try and make that be communicated more clearly. And as Tamara sort of said before, one of the things that we wanted to do was see if we can make a verbal scale recommendation that was based on data, if we could. And the goal of gathering all that information from those, from that published summary of all the internal validation was to provide us that information to see if we could come up with a scale that did mesh with the data well. And then the other thing that we wanted to keep in mind was that all these recommendations have to keep in mind that what we're doing is trying to communicate results and the meaning of results to users of our reports that really aren't all that in tune with statistical issues, biological issues, and we really wanted to make any recommendations that we had really usable to the end users of this information. And in that regard, you know, we sort of relied on a lot of the experience that members of the working group had. Some of the members of the working group had been reporting likelihood ratios for decades. Others had been reporting likelihood ratios for a few years using their probabilistic genotyping systems. And so we combined the experience that each of these individuals had in their own laboratories with conveying this information to try and provide recommendations that would be useful to the end user. So with that kind of understanding of where we came from, I'd like to go through the recommendations that we came up with and give you a little bit more background information on exactly sort of the discussions that led to the recommendations coming out as they are. So recommendation 1.1 essentially expresses that the numerical value of the LR is the critical piece of information, and that must be reported, with the exception of exclusions, which I'll get to in recommendation 2.1. But the value of the LR provides the weight of the evidence with regards to the set of propositions used in that evaluation. And this value can stand apart from any verbal predicate used to describe it. It can be complemented by a verbal predicate or a verbal description of the meaning of the value of that LR. But really, you know, the publications that I had up on the slide earlier, they all kind of keep coming back to this theme that the opposite is not true. A verbal scale statement should not be reported in the absence of the value of the LR. Most of the studies have found that when you report a verbal scale statement alone in the absence of a number, it is more likely to be misunderstood by the audience. The other thing that kind of went into these discussions is the fact that most of LR calculations for subsource or sub-subsource propositions, laboratories are calculating multiple LRs for using allele frequencies from multiple population groups. In that, some laboratories, instead of reporting out all the values of the LRs that they're calculating, choose to report a single value in their reports. And they maintain the others in the case notes, but they're reporting just a single value. The working group discussed that for a while and ultimately determined that reporting a single value was an acceptable practice. However, based off of the information that we collected from laboratories, there was different ways that laboratories were reporting it. Some were choosing the lowest value all the time. Some were choosing the values that were closest to 1. And we discussed that when coming up with these recommendations. And the working group considered, again, that reporting a single value, if you've calculated multiple LRs, is an acceptable practice. But we recommend that when you do that, if you're going to report a single value, that it's the lowest value of the calculated LRs that should be reported. And in general, although you can have some discussions about certain specific situations, in general, the lowest value will be the one that is most beneficial to the person of interest. And so that is kind of the underlying reason why it was chosen to be the lowest value that should be reported if you're only reporting a single value. Now, if an LR is set up in a typical fashion with an inclusionary proposition divided by an exclusionary proposition, the lowest LR will be that one that benefits the person of interest the most. So when we're giving this recommendation, the recommendation is not to set up the LR, calculate, do 1 over the LR, and then report the lowest value, because that will not be the one that is most beneficial to the person of interest. Now, recommendation 1.2 essentially states that a verbal scale is an option. Given the number of published and unpublished verbal scales in circulation, the working group felt that for the benefit of consistency both within and between laboratories, if we could, it would just be a single verbal scale that would be recommended. Now, since the magnitude of an LR describes how much more likely one explanation of the evidence is over another explanation of the evidence, the meaning of that magnitude shouldn't differ from analyst to analyst or laboratory to laboratory. And as we can see from the information that Geraldine went through, and Tamara sort of alluded to as well, right now, if we have an LR of a certain value that is calculated in one laboratory, it may be described one way, for instance, moderate support for a proposition in one laboratory, and that might be limited support in another laboratory and strong support in yet a third laboratory. And for the purposes of consistency between laboratories, we felt that it was important that only a single verbal scale should be recommended. In addition to that, because a verbal scale is really a complement to the numerical value of the LR, really, if that's going to be useful to anybody who's using that information, we need to provide context for that person to be able to adequately assess the strength of that evidence. And for that reason, the working group's recommendation was that the entire scale should be provided, such that whoever is using that report, whoever is hearing that testimony, has that context provided for them so that they can more clearly understand what is being conveyed to them. So when it came to determining the recommended scale, the working group had countless discussions on, the meanings of the different words that were used in the various verbal scales, as well as the ranges corresponding to those terms. In addition, as Tamara described, we looked at a lot of information from available empirical data, and we kind of used that to inform our discussions on a verbal scale. What emerged from those discussions was obviously the recommendations for a verbal scale that are on the screen right now. And like this scale, like any other verbal scale, is subject to criticism. Just in terms of the word choices, we had options of slight, limited, weak for our lowest range of support for a proposition. All those words, inherently have issues with them, and we had to pick one. And after much discussion, we decided that limited had sort of the least amount of baggage associated with it, and it was probably the most easily understood of all the different words that we could use. And those types of discussions went on and ultimately resulted in the recommendations that you see before you. Now, as I said, verbal scales in general are subject to criticism, most commonly because they're all fairly arbitrary. The words mean different things to different people, and the people that created the verbal scales that are published and unpublished, the words that they chose meant slightly different things to each of them, and so that's why they ended up being slightly different. The ranges that are chosen, again, mean different things to different people as well. And ultimately, even though there's all these criticisms about verbal scales in the community, verbal scales, have been used since at least the 1930s. And, we found publications that date back to at least the 80s where verbal scales are sort of recommended to help explain likelihood ratios. And so ultimately, despite all the criticism, there's at least some benefits to verbal scales in helping to convey the meaning of LR values. And if we're going to try and help people understand, I think that consistency is an important part of that. And so I'd kind of just like to go over a little bit more where we kind of started from for the verbal scale recommendation, and kind of use some of the information that Tamara had highlighted already to kind of show you where that falls in. So ultimately, the working group decided that we would start with the MC scale that was published in 2015 as a starting point for our discussion. We kind of felt that was the most recent publication and the most relevant to our discussions. But rather than just adopt the MC scale, the working group, had gotten together and discussed what we wanted to do in terms of making these recommendations. As I said before, one of the goals was to make this information as usable as possible for the end user of our information. And in that regard, again, we kind of lent, each of the working group members lent their own experience to this, and what we came up with was the idea that having too many levels of support was not really beneficial to the end user. It didn't help them to understand. It just further confused some of the issues. And so what we decided to do was try and streamline the verbal scale recommendations. And if you'll notice the MC one that's on the screen right now, they have 4 different levels of strong support. And I think that in the working group's experience, that just lends to additional confusion because you've got 4 different versions of strong support. And ultimately, we ended up reducing the number of adverbs and adjectives that were used to qualify our qualifying statements about the meaning of an LR. And then as Tamara showed, we have the non-contributor data where we've got a variety of different groupings of the data, the first one being from 2 to 99, where we have 98% of our data that showed false support for the inclusionary proposition. We've got the data that is between 100 and 10,000, where we had 1.3% of the LRs that showed false support for the inclusionary proposition. And then we had 0.02% of the LRs that showed false support for the inclusionary proposition between 10,000 and 1 million. Ultimately, that kind of broke down well with a reduced version or a streamlined version of the ENSVI scale. And so we ended up going with the limited support category between 2 and 99. We ended up going with moderate support in between 100 and 10,000, strong support between 10,000 and 1 million, and very strong support was a category that we included basically where we had no evidence of false support for an inclusionary proposition. Now, as Tamara mentioned before, this type of information is all kind of based on the mixtures that you put into non-contributor tests and then the number of non-contributors that you actually compare to. Now, again, to kind of reemphasize what Tamara had said, the majority of this false support was found in the limited category. And ultimately, the information that's in the limited category, when we look at the data that's responsible for causing this sort of false support for the inclusionary proposition for a non-contributor, it generally falls down into categories of data where we have limited obligate allele information for those contributors. It also has lots of possible overlap with higher level contributors in these mixtures or for peaks and stutter positions. And again, there's also a high probability of dropout with these contributors. And so it really isn't surprising that we get some support for HP, which is adventitious in this category, because we really don't have a lot of information in which to base this association on. And so that ultimately ends up in the low value of these LRs. Now, the highest value observed for a non-contributor was 505,000, as Tamara said. And again, when you look at that data as to why it generated an LR that was so high, is because there was so much overlap. And as mixtures get more complex, you're more likely to have false associations or false support for an inclusionary proposition by chance alone. That's just the nature of complex mixtures. Now, recommendation 2.1, I think that really does stem from a few different approaches that were out there in U.S. laboratories. The different approaches really stem from a couple of different ways of thinking about how to go about interpreting and comparing evidence. Some laboratories that have binary systems, and then some of the laboratories with probabilistic genotyping systems online will include or exclude prior to running a sample through their probabilistic genotyping system. So they'll evaluate the data and make inclusions or exclusions prior to actually running these samples. Others that are using probabilistic genotyping systems will run the samples through their systems and then use the LR value to determine whether they're going to include or exclude. And still others will just report out the support for whichever proposition is favored, more of that traditional use of the likelihood ratio, and they won't try and apply these sort of binary labels of inclusion or exclusion to this continuum of LR values. When looking at the different practices out there, we really found that some people were excluding outright, some people were excluding after getting an LR value, and some people weren't really excluding conclusively at all. And we got to talking about, is there any danger to excluding somebody from a mixture when you're using likelihood ratios, especially if you get a likelihood ratio other than 0? And ultimately, we again went back to the experience of some of the people that had been reporting out likelihood ratios from probabilistic genotyping systems, and their collected experience kind of told us that really having a variety of degrees for support for exclusion wasn't really received well by investigators and attorneys and juries, and so in this desire to simplify reporting practices, we decided that really as a pragmatic approach to reporting LRs that supported the exclusionary proposition, laboratories could opt to simply exclude an individual from being a contributor to a sample if they got an LR below a certain value. But we had to have discussions about what point that became reasonable to say that a person of interest was excluded. Conceptually, everybody agreed that once you had an LR that was 1,000,000 times more likely to see this evidence if a random person's DNA was present there than if the person you were comparing's DNA was present. But at what point did that sort of become more gray? And at what point do we say, I'm not too sure if I can actually exclude at this point? And so because LRs are not definitive and statements of exclusion are, we really tried to look at where we felt as a working group that we could take an LR and then exclude based off the value of that LR. Now, the fact that LRs are in themselves not conclusive, we felt that if you had an LR value that was really close to 1, even if it was less than 1, it probably should not be reported as an exclusion. And after much discussion, the working group settled on 0.01 as the upper bound for declaring exclusions outright. So at that level, it would be 100 times more likely to observe the evidence if a random person's DNA was present than if the person of interest DNA were present in that sample. And ultimately, the working group felt that that should be the upper bound, but we felt that laboratories could define that value themselves. However, that as a recommendation, we felt that anything that was in between 1 and 0.01 shouldn't be reported as an outright exclusion. So after looking at the verbal scales used in U.S. laboratories, almost all of them had inconclusive zones that spanned 1 to some order of magnitude greater and less than 1. Now, that led the working group to a discussion of inconclusive zones. Now, since LRs are just a measure of the probabilities of evidence under different explanation, the only truly inconclusive LR is when the probability of both propositions have equal weight and are equal. And any LR that is not 1 demonstrates support for one proposition over the other. It may not be much support, but it actually is support. And essentially, the working group felt that any single LR for which the value of the LR is not 1 should not be considered inconclusive. Now, this obviously generated considerable discussion within the working group, and I know it's generated considerable discussion outside the working group. But I wanted to give you a little bit more information on some of the reasons and some of the things that we considered when we were discussing the use of inconclusive zones. Some of the things that we looked at were the reasons that laboratories had inconclusive zones. Tamara touched on that a little bit earlier. I'll touch on that again. Another one is the potential for bias. Another consideration was the hierarchy of propositions, as well as the fact that likelihoods ratios could be used in other disciplines. So I know in my laboratory, and as Tamara sort of explained from the FBI's perspective, originally when we went through and created our verbal scales, we created these inconclusive zones, and generally they were meant as a means of mitigating potential of including a person of interest incorrectly. And maybe secondarily, another issue that might be trying to be mitigated is preventing investigators, attorneys, or juries from misusing or misunderstanding weak evidence. That whole weak evidence misunderstanding, when people think that because it's weak for one proposition, it's actually strong for the other. People wanted to, kind of mitigate the chance of that misunderstanding occurring. And so for those reasons, a lot of laboratories generated inconclusive zones based off their validation data. I think the 28 million non-contributor tests demonstrated that really most of the LRs that we're seeing with these systems are on the correct side of one, but that it is possible to have false support for a proposition. And in general, that false support for a proposition can occur outside pretty much everyone's established inconclusive zones. And so if you're trying to mitigate the potential of falsely including somebody, and I'll use that with the flying quotation marks that nobody can see me doing right now, you're not actually doing that by implementing that inconclusive zone. In addition, as part of the discussions that we had, there's also potentially some unintended consequences of having these inconclusive zones. One of those unintended consequences may be to cause people to have greater confidence in LR values that are outside that inconclusive zone and mistakenly think that they are more conclusive than they are. Again, we're putting these binary type thresholds onto a continuous system. And if we have an inconclusive zone that goes up to 100, and we say an LR of 99 is inconclusive, but an LR of 101 we're going to report, somebody might mistakenly think that that value of 101 is a lot more conclusive than it really is. And so that was one of the other considerations that we had when we had these discussions. One of the other things that we discussed was the concept of bias. And if you've got an inconclusive zone that spans 1 and goes between 1 and say 0.01 or 0.001, ultimately you've got LRs whose value indicates that it supports the exclusionary proposition. If a laboratory is taking those LRs and reporting them as inconclusive, you are not disclosing information that might be potentially beneficial to a person of interest. And that could be viewed as prosecution bias. And one of the things that we kind of wanted to avoid was implementing a recommendation that could be seen as bias towards the prosecution. And then lastly, inconclusive zones that are established for DNA comparison could prevent reporting of helpful LRs in other levels of the hierarchy of proposition, such as activity level propositions, or potentially in other disciplines. In looking at activity level propositions, it's not uncommon to have low values for LRs for activity level propositions. And if you create an inconclusive zone that is far too wide, which ultimately just goes to measuring the probability of evidence under different propositions, you could create a situation where you are unable to make any sort of statements about activity level propositions. And levels that we set within the DNA community, if LRs become more commonplace in other disciplines, the inconclusive zones that we set could also have ramifications in those other disciplines. And so we wanted to keep that in mind when making the recommendations. And so ultimately, our recommendation from the working group was against using an inconclusive zone when reporting an LR. And that comes down to the variety of reasons that I've kind of just discussed. And that kind of brings us through the recommendations from the ad hoc working group for genotyping results reported as likelihood ratios. Those are available on the SWGDAM website. There's that link on the screen. And ultimately, I think that the recommendations that emerged from this working group were really designed for reporting LRs regardless of the propositions used or, again, the disciplines that they're used in. The recommendations were intended to provide transparency and consistency in the reporting of LRs in the U.S. And hopefully, just based off of that little bit of information that I was able to provide during my time, you've got a little bit more background information, and so you can kind of see where the working group was coming from and why the recommendations were published as they were. And right now, I think I will pass the presentation off to Stephen, and we'll talk about using basically reporting likelihood ratios.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks everyone for attending. So we're stepping away from the verbal scale recommendations for a minute and just kind of going through a little reminder or discussion, chat about actually how you present likelihood ratios. So we talked a lot about these verbal, equivalents. We thought we'd just put it in a bigger picture, especially for, those in the audience who maybe are just starting out trying to get, for example, a probabilistic genotyping system online. Clearly, we have many attendees who are well-versed in likelihood ratios, and so for this point, you probably have about 20 minutes to go to Starbucks and come back again, so feel free to step away. What is the reporting statistic that we've been talking about? It's this likelihood ratio. So LR, the likelihood ratio is, we're going to use this for our quantifiable testable evidence. And what do we mean by evidence? We're meaning, in this case, our DNA profile. So PR for this designation would be the probability of observing that evidence under two competing propositions, sometimes called hypotheses or explanations, but basically two different ways. They're mutually exclusive, but they could both explain this evidence. So in this display, we've got HP being the prosecution theory or proposition, HD being the defense theory. Now both of these, when we say prosecution and defense, putting that in there because that's typically, we're talking about bringing evidence into court. We all understand that these are proxy words, or they're proxy propositions. When I, as the analyst, come up with two mutually exclusive ways you could explain or create this evidence, is this actually representative of either side? We'll find that out ultimately, but for just kind of ease of discussion, they're most often thought of in this. You might like or prefer H1 and H2, or HP and HA, where A is alternate, but that's, for simplicity, we'll just go with HP and HD for now. So, to just kind of really drive home that key point about what a likelihood ratio is, we're always talking about the probability of an outcome. That outcome is the same regardless of which proposition you're evaluating it under. So the probability of winning, or not winning, just finishing the San Francisco Marathon, something I've never even tried to do, but the idea is, what is the probability someone would finish the San Francisco Marathon, if they prepared for it by doing your team and training style 20-week training plan, what's the probability you'd finish that marathon if you did that training plan? You're going to compare that to the probability of the exact same outcome, finishing that marathon if you prepared for it by, playing video games on the couch and eating chicken wings. So in both cases, you're dealing with the probability of that outcome, and you're looking at, well, is it more probable you'd finish if you did one training versus if you did a different one? And you can get some sense, most people can figure out and get a sense of, well, that outcome is more probable under one than the other. Another example, what's the probability of looking out your car door and seeing a pride of lions standing there? And what I love about this picture is that the door is open. I mean, you might want to close that door. But, is that more probable if you're in a game park in Tanzania versus if you're in downtown San Francisco? And I had to include that little bit of San Francisco because it includes a club called the DNA Lounge. It just seemed appropriate. So, under which proposition is that view of lions, that evidence, that event more probable? So, transitioning to likelihood ratios, it's not been easy for everyone. In this country especially, we've had long history using frequentist approaches. Probably most of the country was using CPI. A subset of the country was using RMP approaches. And some of the challenge of the transition for people is that you now really need to specify these propositions or hypotheses. And you're dealing not just with, one probability, you're looking at ratios of conditional probabilities. And, for some approaches, you can even be looking at joint probabilities, not just, one randomly selected person, for example. But, one of the biggest fears is just saying it incorrectly. And the reality is that transposing conditionals, saying these things incorrectly, is easy to do. If we were all in one room, I'd try and reassure you all that this was a safe space, and if you dared say something wrong, no one's going to jump down your throat. But, this is something that people have been concerned about. And so, hopefully I won't do it today. I can't guarantee, you never can. But hopefully, I'll give you some different ways and theories and approaches to maybe, saying some of these things. So, great example I found in a presentation given by Mike Coble, and he was citing Peter Gill. Looking at this, the probability it will rain under different kind of situations that could lead up to that event. So, the likelihood ratio here, the probability it'll rain in the afternoon if it's cloudy in the morning. The probability it will, again, the exact same event, rain in the afternoon if it's sunny in the morning. And so that ratio would be if the probability it'll rain in the afternoon if it's cloudy in the morning is 0.8, and the probability it'll rain in the afternoon if it's sunny in the morning is 0.2, well, the ratio is 4, meaning the probability it'll rain in the afternoon is 4 times more likely if it's cloudy in the morning than if it's sunny in the morning. And if you use this kind of statement, this is bulletproof stuff. If you can get that out and not mix that up, then you're going to do great all times. But, is that the only way to say it, for example? Can we think of some other things that aren't invalid, but maybe add a little flexibility than always saying that one exact statement? And if asked to restate it, just going, well, here's the statement I just gave you. So putting it into words, though, we do have to take care, especially when we're trying to simplify the language, because everyone's, goal is to make this understandable for the people who actually have to ultimately incorporate this information and try and make some judgments based upon it. So if you oversimplify, you can sometimes end up with wrong statements. And the people who don't know that maybe you're simplifying it might think that that's really all there is to it, and then they could propagate that. And really, I mean, juries may not be able to tell. On first blush, a juror may hear the exact same thing if you say it correctly or if you say it incorrectly. This is not anything new in likelihood ratios. This was the case for CPI. This was the case for RMP. You know, people can misunderstand things. But that doesn't mean you don't try and make sure that you're saying it correctly, because you don't want to give people a false understanding. And, you know, there are also people who will be hearing what you're saying, who do know what they're talking about, and you want to make sure you're saying it correctly for all parties involved. Of course, the person from the local newspaper, no matter what you say, they are going to say it incorrectly in the story about you. So here's, you know, a way a simplification could have a problem. Kind of falling or going from that previous example. You know, if you say your likelihood ratio is just a ratio of two probabilities, probability of event 1 divided by probability of event 2. Well, if you're talking about the chance of rain is 80% and the chance of no rain is 20%, and then say it's a likelihood ratio for rain over no rain is 4, that's not really what we've been trying to do with likelihood ratios, because rain and no rain are not the same event. In that particular example, you've actually created an odds. But the key thing is that we're always trying to assess that exact same event, given different ways you could get there. So transposing the conditional, that phrase is always out there. It's a real common thing, and it's a common concern. And again, not anything new to likelihood ratios. This has been an issue and a concern for a long time. You know, one of the classic examples of this, you know, the probability you have 4 legs if you're an elephant. That is not the same thing as the probability you're an elephant if you have 4 legs. So we have to make sure we're keeping track of what we can assign a probability to and what this means. So, you know, take a little chance to, you know, see if you can kind of say yay or nay on your own for a second. So, you know, take a second to look at the statement and, you know, think to yourself, is this a reasonable wording of the LR or not? You know, the evidence profile is LR times more likely to be observed if the victim and the POI are the contributors than if the victim and a random unrelated person are the contributors. So does that feel good? Does it feel bad? I mean, I would say this is pretty much standard sort of wording for LRs. This would be A-OK. You know, you're talking about that probability of the evidence. It's LR times more likely to be observed if. You know, you're comparing those two propositions. Now, there are variants in there for more likely to be observed if, could be likely if or probable if. But this is pretty standard wording. You know, what about this one? You know, probability of observing this evidence profile is LR. Notice I say LR or 1 over LR times higher or lower if the victim and the POI are the contributors than if the victim and the random unrelated person are the contributors. This is also, in my view, A-OK, and I actually really like this wording. You know, it's all the same benefits of the previous one, but what's great about it is that, you know, you're always using a whole number value in this. You know, if the LR was greater than 1, you use the LR. If the LR was less than 1, you use 1 over the LR. And, you know, it's higher or lower. Well, if the LR was greater than 1, you use higher. If the LR is less than 1, you use lower. So I think this is great wording for an LR. So this version, you know, the profile is LR times more likely to be observed in a mixture of the victim and POI than in a mixture of the victim and a randomly selected unrelated person. I think we're still okay. You're still talking about that probability of the evidence, you know, LR, you know, times more likely to be observed. You're still comparing those two propositions in a mixture of the, and then giving two different propositions. So far, we've got a couple of variations on the theme that I think are all okay. So what about these things? You know, all of them kind of starting with this assumption of 2 contributors. LR, the evidence profile is LR times more likely to be from the victim and the POI than from the victim and a random person. The profile that the victim and the POI are the contributors to this evidence profile is LR times higher or lower than the probability that the victim and a random unrelated person are the contributors. It is LR times more likely that the victim and the POI are the contributors of this evidence profile than it is that the victim and a random unrelated person are the contributors. So these are really common ways that LR statements go awry. More likely to be from, the probability that, not if, but that the victim and the POI are the contributors. More likely that the victim and the POI are the contributors. So it's these be froms and that's that in these statements are where these are going awry. Now, no disparagement to any of the attorneys on the line, but I think a lot of the time that testimony can all of a sudden go south. The criminals may be presenting their evidence using the wording, that's perfectly fine. They've got their if statements in there. And then they're asked some follow-up question. In the courtroom, typically you have, 3 liberal arts majors controlling, who generally oftentimes avoided science class with a passion, kind of steering the bus. And so they might, because they're thinking of it in especially the way the jury is going to be thinking of it, and the jury's trying to weigh the propositions, not that evidence given the propositions. So they might ask in other words statements. And, the second you hear in other words, you really should slow down and make sure you're listening to what is said before you just go and say, yes, that's correct. So, you might hear someone say, you indicated it was LR times more likely that Mr. Doe is the DNA donor, correct? No, that's not correct. So it's LR times more likely it came from Mr. Doe than someone else. So these are things that you should always be on the watch for and just really make sure you just don't knee-jerk say, yes, that's correct. So looking at this one, take a second, think about, does this seem okay to you? LR times more likely we observed if the person of interest is a contributor than if he is not a contributor. So it's got your ifs. It's talking about the evidence is more likely to be observed. It's got 2 mutually exclusive propositions. Well, my issue with that simplified a statement is that it's missing the rest of the propositions. So POI is a contributor. It doesn't tell you about anyone else in the proposition. Maybe it's the POI, maybe it's a 3-person mixture. So POI is not the only person there. And when you say he is not a contributor, that's really exhaustive of every other possible option that's out there. A randomly selected unrelated person or a relative of his or hers or any other contributor, or maybe a specific other contributor. So I think if you have clearly defined the propositions elsewhere in the report, then this kind of statement may be fine. But if you, in your testimony or in your report, didn't lay out those propositions, this is leaving too much unsaid in my view. So you could salvage it, for example, the likelihood of obtaining this DNA profile from 2 individuals was determined for the following propositions. List those 2 propositions. Then you could kind of get away with saying LR times more likely to be observed if the POI is a contributor, which is the first proposition, than if he is not a contributor, which is the second proposition. So in this case now, because you've laid them out in advance, he is not a contributor is no longer an exhaustive statement. Now, is there any more kind of vernacular phrase, not to go into, my background in my youth, but, raised a Catholic and you got this whole Vatican II thing. I never had to hear Mass in Latin. We got to hear it in English in my church. And so, is there vernacular for more likely to be observed or probable if, just in case people that doesn't resonate with them. So thinking about these propositions, they lead to higher probabilities when the proposal fits that observed data. Basically, if the proposal explains the data you have, you tend to end up with a high probability, and when the proposal doesn't fit the data well, you tend to end up with a low probability. So thinking about just a standard kinship Mendelian genetics kind of example, if you're talking about the probability you'd have a homozygous P kid, well, if both parents are homozygous P, barring rare mutation, just thinking standard Mendel, it's a 100% chance they're going to create a homozygous P kid. But the probability of creating that PP homozygous P kid, if the parents are both heterozygotes, and so they share a P, but they're not homozygotes, neither one is, you've reduced that to 25% chance. And so in general, it kind of got covered up by the image there, sorry, in getting translated from PowerPoint. But basically, the two PP parents more easily explain that kid's type than the two heterozygous parents. So thinking about an example using probabilistic genotyping, what if you had a two-person mixture? So, we're going to kind of build a two-person mixture. We're going to propose a possible two-person mixture. So the first thing we'll do is we'll propose one contributor, and we'll come up with a set of genotypes that they could have, and maybe we'll also factor in things like, template and degradation and how well each locus amplifies in comparison to other loci. So we'll propose that person, we'll add that person to our mixture, or proposed mixture. And then we'll come up with a second person. And that person has different genotypes maybe, or sometimes the same. They have different template levels maybe. Maybe they're even degraded a little bit differently. We're going to add that person to our mixture. So we've built this two-person mixture as a proposal. Now the next step will be, well, how well did that proposed, mixture actually explain our observed data? What's the probability you'd see that observed data if this is how you created that mixture? Sorry, I hit the wrong key. So if the proposed mixture, really replicates well the observed data, it means it was a good fit to the data, explains that data well, and so the probability of seeing that evidence given that proposal or hypothesis would be high. If, on the other hand, your proposal was a really poor fit to the data, you've got, really different peak heights than expected. Maybe you've got a peak in the data that really wasn't even there in your proposal, or vice versa, one in your proposed mixture that wasn't in the data. What's going to happen there? Well, the probability of seeing that evidence, because in both situations, it is the same evidence. The probability of seeing that evidence given this proposal is going to be low. So, with probabilistic genotyping, these, probabilities quantify how well those propositions fit the data. So I think some of the vernacular then that you could try and use, and maybe you save this for the in other words explanations. Maybe this isn't your first pass at explaining it to the people. Something like assuming two contributors, this profile is LR times better explained by a mixture of the victim and POI than by a mixture of the victim and a randomly selected person. Or similarly, assuming two contributors, a mixture of the victim and POI fits the evidence LR times better than a mixture of the victim and a randomly selected person. So again, you're still talking about, how well these propositions fit the evidence in both situations, and getting that LR in there. So just some ideas on how you could expand maybe the way you present this to people. You're always safe getting that standard if statement like on that, like Peter Gill was recommending. That is good, solid stuff, but maybe you could have a little bit of flexibility built into your toolkit. So getting back to that reporting statistic, and again, adding possible flexibility to how you describe these LRs. So in that evidence, if that DNA profile was more probable under the numerator proposition, your LR is going to be greater than 1. And so that LR is favoring or supporting that numerator proposition. Now, if that evidence DNA profile was more probable under the alternate proposition, HD, then your LR will be less than 1, and it will favor or support that alternate proposition. Again, of course, if they're equal to 1, magically end up with that 1.00000, then your LR provides equal support to both. It's not that it doesn't support either, it's that it's equal support to both. And so, part for me of where I like the idea of a verbal scale comes from, when I've testified, when I used to give a number that didn't have any kind of descriptor like that, I sometimes, from either attorney, sometimes both, this desire to go, well, what does that mean to you? What does that number mean to you? And, rather than have something that you're kind of making up on the fly of, well, let me think about what this means to me, I like the idea that a lot of different people could look to the same scale and come up with the same answer. So that is a really nice aspect to it to me. And where does it all fit into things? Where is this concept of support, for one or the other coming from? I mean, it has at its core Bayes' theorem. So you've got this prior odds in the odds form times your likelihood ratio is the posterior odds. In your prior odds, if the first proposition is, so this is the stuff the jury is thinking about, for example, if that first proposition is more probable than the second proposition prior to hearing your DNA stuff, then their prior odds is greater than 1. If it's less probable than the alternate proposition, then the prior odds is less than 1. So what is an LR greater than 1 doing? It's increasing the ratio of H1 over H2. It may not make it where the posterior odds is greater than 1. That's not necessarily going to happen, but it is increasing the ratio so that your posterior odds would be higher than your prior odds. And in increasing that ratio, it's providing support for H1. And if your LR is less than 1, you're decreasing the ratio of H1 over 2 in that transition to a posterior odds. Your prior odds will actually be greater than your posterior odds, and your LR would be providing support for H2. So, as was mentioned previously, we did look at the MC guidelines to see what they had. They were out certainly before anything we came up with. And so they had some verbal predicate wording suggestions. An LR equals 1. The forensic findings do not support one proposition over the other. If it's greater than 1, the forensic findings provide, some level of support for the first proposition relative to the alternative. When it's less than 1, they provide that some level of support for the alternative proposition relative to the first proposition. I really like this bit they had in there. In cases where the reader could be misled as described above, forensic practitioners shall add additional comments. So they talk about, where there's weak support for the first proposition, how that could be misinterpreted as strong support for the alternative. So there's the weak evidence effect, it's been termed, where if someone hears, well, there's weak evidence for this, they could think in their head that means strong evidence for the other side. And so it's actually beneficial to make some statements in there that's saying, yes, there's weak support for this first proposition. That's not intended to say that there's strong support for the alternate. The first proposition still has stronger support than the alternate proposition. But overall, when comparing, the levels of support, this is weak. So I like that they get that in there. So some variations on a theme, you could say the likelihood ratios provide, some level of support for the proposition that, whoever are the contributors of the DNA extracted from the evidence versus the proposition that another group are the contributors. So I've got a couple different options in there, and you might say versus or over or compared to or relative to. So again, it's just, if you can have some variations on the theme, maybe some version resonates with someone that another version doesn't. Now coming back to that notion of can you simplify though, the verbal, the level of support for a particular proposition really is only in the context of the alternate propositions that went into those LRs. So, you don't want to leave this notion that, this is strong support, that this guy's in this DNA compared to every other possible option out there. So it really needs to have the propositions well defined, in your report or wherever. And I'm trying to wrap up here, but if you do define all the propositions clearly, I think it's okay to shortcut things. You just need to make sure that they are well defined. So you could say, likelihood ratios provide strong support for the proposition that so-and-so is the contributor or are the contributor of the DNA. That's all assuming the propositions that have been evaluated have been very clearly defined. And there's some of the literature has talked, kind of put their sentences or bits of sentences where they're only using the one. Evitt, had the verbal equivalent evidence to support, some standards for formulation of evaluated forensic science expert opinion from Science and Justice. The findings do not support one proposition over the other for one. LR greater than one. Findings provide support for the prosecution's proposition. They didn't clearly state versus the alternate. Again, I think if you really are making sure that everyone understands and has heard what the proposition pairing was, then I think it's okay to shortcut things a bit on that kind of final standards statement or that support statement. Now, one last, evaluation. Is this an acceptable, in other words, kind of statement? There is a strong likelihood that the defendant's DNA is on the item. That seem okay? I would say no, that's not okay. Support for is not the same as likelihood that. Likelihood is specifically a conditional probability. The likelihood ratio is not a probability at all. It's a ratio of two conditional probabilities. So it helps drive up or down the prior odds when leading to the posterior odds, but it is not a likelihood. So you can't say there's a likelihood that the defendant's DNA is on the item. This statement really is all about a posterior probability. So I'm sorry for a little bit of geeky math from there. But that would not be an okay translation. So, you might think in the end, maybe we should skip all the verbal stuff and go to a visual scale. I would personally love to have a whole scale from Guppy to JAWS to bring into the courtroom. I've not yet had this opportunity. But I think it would get things across. The probability of finding an arm bitten off on the beach the next day, or maybe it was a leg, with a large tooth in it, given that it was a guppy that, attacked her versus a, JAWS. Anyway, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. That was the last slide of our presentations.
All right, thank you all of our presenters. We're going to jump right into it as we have a ton of questions to try to get through. We probably will run a little bit over since we do have so many questions. The first one we're going to throw out there to Tamara. Craig was asking, was there any data generated by programs other than STR mix looked at, such as semi-continuous platforms?
We did have a member on the subcommittee that is a TrueAllele user, an experienced user with TrueAllele. But I think it's fair to state, and I'm sitting here in California next to Stephen, so I welcome him to help with the answer. But I think our overall perspective on this is that an LR, as it speaks to one proposition relative to the other, is independent in a sense, and that might be the wrong term I'm using, but of how that LR was generated, in my view. What do you think, Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, there's this notion, an LR is an LR. The comparison of the, the evidence under the two propositions, it's that ratio really is separating it away from a particular approach to how you got there. Kind of thinking about, trying to draw it back to frequentist approaches. If you had an RMP that maybe used a lot more interpretation ability, for a particular case, particular sample, you came up with an RMP of 1 in 100. And then you had a different case where you had a CPI, very different, formulation going into things, different levels of evaluation of the data. You came up with a CPI of 1 in 100. In the end, both of those mean 1 in 100. Both of them, there's a 1 in 100 chance that a non-contributor would, be included as a possible contributor, even though you had very different ways to get there. So, this is part of why we brought in this discussion also of non-DNA tests, and where, if we've got this scale and we're saying it's inconclusive for an LR out to, 1,000 or 10,000, well, for systems and approaches that give LRs of 100, that means that they basically
All right.
would always be inconclusive.
Sean had quite a few questions that came in during his, so we'll throw one to Sean. What other software other than STR Mix were included in the studies?
I don't believe that any of the other software packages were included in the data that we had. It was all from StarMix, from that response to the PCAST, and that was basically because of
all right.
who was
Next question we have, we'll
that
throw to Stephen.
Wouldn't
it be better to describe the propositions as contributor and non-contributor rather than prosecution hypothesis and defense hypothesis?
Again, taking a shortcut to move things forward. If you want to say first hypothesis, second hypothesis, contributor, non-contributor, those are all fine. Some of the reality, I think, for a lot of people is that, they're going in and, testifying in court. And, I completely agree with people that, especially oftentimes for a government agency going in to the courtroom, any notion, that 100%, that your hypothesis is what the defense is going to say. No, we don't, unless the defense has told us. But typically people are doing an attempt to give a reasonable proxy proposition, and then hopefully they're open to, if alternate information or new information is provided to them, they can reevaluate the evidence, using better propositions. So I know those phrases are hot buttons to people. But they're trying to be a shortcut. If someone wants to say, hey, in this
all right,
case,
so that question was from William Thompson, and Stephen, we're going to throw you another one. This is a follow-up from Daniel Myers. He's asking, when we are saying inclusionary support in regard to the verbal scale, are we talking about using the verbal scale to convey support for the hypothesis of a person being a contributor to the mixture, or support that they can be included as a possible contributor by the comparison?
So again, trying to think of it in that Bayesian construct, there is a prior probability idea here, comparing, the probability of two, mutually exclusive propositions. And what that LR is doing is it's driving support towards one of those propositions. And so, if the propositions are, for example, assuming that, the person of interest and one random person are the contributors, the alternate proposition is that two random unrelated people are the contributors. this LR is driving support towards one proposition or the other, depending if it's greater than one or less than one. So it's not so much the the possibility that it's driving support towards that proposition. Again, as stated in my talk and addressing, I think, one of the questions, I think Bill Thompson had the question, these levels of support and all of these aren't saying it's probable that the person is there or probable that the person is not there. These aren't probabilities. But in this Bayesian construct of, if you were kind of wishy-washy in your head about whether that DNA, came from this person or not, after hearing your likelihood ratio information, that might increase your belief that it came from them or decrease your belief that it came from them. So it's
all right. Just a reminder for our audience that after the Q&A, we will be moving into closing, where you will have the opportunity to download a PDF version of today's slide deck. So please make sure to stay with us until the very end to be able to download that. And we also had some requests if our subject matter experts would be willing for you to put out your contact emails in the chat pod. That way, just in case we don't get through all of our questions, some follow-up questions could be sent to you. So to all of our presenters, if you are willing to give that out, just go ahead and type that into the main chat pod there. And our audience members, make sure to take that down before you leave. So the next question we have, we'll throw to Sean. How can you say the manner in which the LR is calculated isn't important when an LR that equals 10,000 with a binary method of 13 loci has a different meaning than an LR that equals 10,000 with a fully continuous method with 22 loci?
Yeah, Craig, I don't really think it does mean different things. Ultimately, the LR is evaluating the probability of the evidence under the different propositions. 10,000 is the ratio of those, and so it really shouldn't matter if there's 10 loci, 20 loci. 10,000 is 10,000 regardless. It's 10,000 times more likely for one proposition over the other. And so I really don't think that it does matter what system
so the next question we have
or
seems
how
to
many
be
loci or
kind of
anything
a
like
hot
that.
question. Rachel Hunt threw it out there, and then Michelle would also like to know the answer. How do you recommend verbally reporting 0.01 to 1? We'll throw that one to Stephen.
I'm sorry.
No worries at all.
I was looking at Tamara's email address coming up under my name and was just going
Yes,
to
sir.
comment.
So Rachel Hunt asked, how do you recommend verbally reporting 0.01
anyway, I'm sorry.
to
Could you
1?
repeat the question?
Here, how do you recommend?
So I would say there's limited support for, the alternate proposition.
And basically, the scale can be used reciprocally. So, right?
Yeah.
But we do allow or do recommend for exclusionary type result or HD supporting results that you can declare exclusions outright. If you choose not to call those exclusions, you can basically flip the scale and use it all the way along the HD supporting range.
And in fact, at Cal DOJ here, we have a reciprocal scale, and so we would even have, very strong support for the alternate proposition kind of statements allowed, unless we got a flat-out 0.
All right. So just to spread some of the questions around, I'm just going to pose this one to the group. This is coming from Jessica. She's asking, does the use of the words shall and must in this document possibly misconstrue that these are requirements rather than simply recommendations?
The approach that we have generally taken in our SWGDAM documents is that when we use the words shall and must, They are on topics that are required under the standards. And when, for example, I think it's 11.
This would be like the quality assurance standards.
Yeah, the quality assurance standards for case-working laboratories. Standard 1126 speaks to the laboratory report shall include a qualitative or quantitative statement, and we took that requirement at standard and felt that the number, with respect to ProbGen systems, the number should be or shall be reported. That's the important result, and then the verbal equivalent is the optional one that may. So it is intentional when we do use the words shall or should or may. And I know that the SWGDAM recommendations and guidelines, some people view them or are questions about them as if they are standards, but they are guidelines and recommendations.
All right. So we'll throw another question out to the group. What are the sources of the empirical data?
Well, the 31 laboratories, basically those described in the PCAS paper, those are all of the laboratories' mixtures that were used in each of their respective internal validations. And so the slide that I had described them, and there's more data in Joe's paper, but they're generated from the various kits, and as each of the laboratories made their efforts to cover the types of mixtures that they encounter in casework, so they will be covering a whole range of template amounts and contributor ratios and numbers of contributors.
And that paper is published in FSIG, so the foundational, you can read about the
all right. Next question we'll give to Sean. Can you speak to reporting using the stratified LR or one that incorporates population structure? It is allowable in your recommendation 1.1.
Yeah, I think the working group's position on this was that it really doesn't matter how the likelihood ratio is generated. We're just kind of speaking to what you should report out, or the recommendations for what you should report out after you've calculated. So if you're doing a stratified or some other LR calculation, it really
all right. Next question we have
the recommendations at all.
We'll go to Stephen. What are the range of values included as 1 for the uninformative range 1, 1.4, 1.5?
I'm not sure if Stephen's there, but I'll try and answer that.
Oh, sorry, I had muted it. When I looked down to see if it was mute, the light was at its non-flash point. I'll just throw in, we actually did discuss that during meetings. We spent a reasonable amount of time talking about exactly that issue, and really, I think pretty much that people are thinking, if you're truncating the value, 1.9 to 1 over 1.9, the key thing is at that point, there is no information right there because you're straddling 1, you're right at 1 basically, that, like in our laboratory practice, we're going to truncate. So our next tier starts at 2. And so I guess, I hesitate to say this, that we have an uninformative range of 1.9 to 1 over 1.9. The actual number is still there, but as far as what our verbal predicate would be, you're really dealing with uninformative. You're basically at 1, especially because you can almost never get exactly 1. So, there comes a point, a lot of people are expending a lot of energy thinking about what it means to be 1.001. And I think we have bigger things to think about. I'm not trying to be smarmy about that either. I just really think that we're spending a lot of time on a really trivial point.
And we discussed in the group as well. Should we have recommendations about whether you should round or truncate? And we felt that was a little bit in the weeds. That laboratories are already working with numbers and probably already have approaches for what they do with match probabilities, and that's pretty much up to the laboratory. Our philosophy is that we
All right.
want to round
So the next question we have, we'll pose again to the group from Pia. She's asking, are the laboratories of all the ad hoc committee members fully adopting all of these recommendations?
Cal DOJ already has.
San Diego will be shortly. We're in the process of doing it right now.
The FBI has.
And as was in the chat room, OCME is not incorporating all of the recommendations.
All right. Going back to discussing this in the court and referring to juries, Paul just made a comment saying that he wished there was a more simple way to express this to a jury. And then William came with a question we'll pose to the group. How do you know what the defense proposition is? What is the defense theory? What if the defense theory is that the true contributor was a relative?
Well, so, as I stated, we're trying to come up with the reasonable and not the reasonable, a reasonable either pair or possibly multiple pairs of propositions that could, explain this evidence. And, in general, there's always the chance that the pairs that were picked do not actually include those that will be truly discussed in front of the juror. I can speak for Cal DOJ. We actually present multiple pairs in many cases for a given mixture. And then in our, not always in the reports, but in the bench notes, additional propositions such as, the alternate person being a relative of the person of interest are also present. So the best thing that can be done is if a report comes out and, again, at least it depends on the software package, but some software packages, the results will just default include those pieces of information. In a perfect world, if we guessed wrong, someone will tell us, and they'll tell us in a timely enough manner that we can actually calculate a proposition, calculate a likelihood ratio for the relevant proposition pairs because, ideally, certainly, you want the jury to be hearing relevant information and representative of what else they've been hearing in there. So, if it's the phrase defense proposition, that is hanging people up, you're free to use other phrases. And, again, in our agency, again, I can speak to our agency, we do actually include in our reports, information saying that effectively, if we guessed wrong, please tell us. Within certain limitations, we will try and calculate a likelihood ratio that better represents
staying on
the true
go ahead, I'm sorry.
of either side.
And so Paul, I'm sorry. I just wanted to address Paul's point, and certainly, this transition is hard, and it also entails a change in the way that we think as well as communicate. But the more and more that I speak with people who, for decades, have been communicating likelihood ratios. Peter Gill was on our ad hoc committee, and speaking to others in Australasia and then in England who have been communicating these results for many, many years, they are somewhat perplexed at the difficulties we have with some of these concepts. They are perplexed with what our issue is with the LR of 2, given that it could potentially be adventitiously supporting a non-contributor. And I keep going back to the example that it's like a common match probability, and we really have been dealing with these types of numbers before, and just a low LR or LR close to 1 or a common match statistic just inherently by its value, there's nothing inconclusive in that number. It is a conclusive value that was generated in the analysis. So, but I feel for what you're saying, and that was the reason that Stephen was included in the webinar, to try to give some guidance. And at the FBI laboratory, Geraldine could comment as well, because Geraldine manages this aspect of our casework operations, but we do review of testimony transcripts to aid our examiners and to catch instances where it might have been misstated, or to aid our examiners in seeing how the line of questioning, we can review the line of questioning went, and help folks to navigate those types of questions easily in the future.
Yeah, so we have done a number of testimony transcript reviews, and what we find is that our examiners have gotten better over the course of having implemented this a couple of years ago. And at first it was very difficult for us to correctly convey the information in the right way. And when we reviewed some of those and passed it by our senior statistician, he said, I see that you're not saying it correctly, but it's not something that anyone is going to have, that anyone is necessarily even going to pick up on. So if you listen to it, if you were to just observe that testimony, you might not have even heard it. The jury's not getting the incorrect information. However, it's still our responsibility to try to convey those likelihood ratios appropriately and correctly, so that any misunderstanding is not because of something that we said incorrectly, but rather just maybe they aren't understanding exactly what we're saying. So we had some examiners that had a tendency to jump ahead into the simplistic versions of the statements without first setting those up properly, and those simplistic versions sometimes led to some veering away from our language that we recommend. So we've spent a lot of additional time training on those topics to try to ensure that our examiners are
all right. So the next question we'll give to Sean, but I really feel like everyone in the group can probably contribute to this. Jennifer's asking, can you further explain the difference between exclusion and limited moderate support for the HD? I would definitely like an easier way to explain it to a jury.
Well, that recommendation is basically an option for laboratories. A laboratory can choose to have a threshold below which they actually exclude, and basically it was just a decision that once you reach a certain level of support for the exclusionary proposition, really the chance that their DNA is truly there is not very high, and ultimately there's no really harm to the defendant in just excluding them from that profile. And so that was kind of the decision, was that at a certain point it just becomes easier for the users of the information to just tell them that person's DNA is not there. And so that was the genesis of that recommendation. But when we get numbers that are close enough to 1, the working group just felt that the support wasn't strong enough to make that definitive statement of exclusion, and so we still feel that they should be reported out as limited support for the exclusionary proposition or the alternate proposition, however you're going to phrase
we'll
that.
move on to the next question. Again, we'll pose this one to the group. I do not feel like we're going to be able to get through all of the questions today, so again, please make sure that you do take down all of our presenters' contact emails there in your screen. That way you can have any follow-ups that you might want to get clarified and answered. So this one to the group: do the SWGDAM guidelines for reporting still mandate that a conclusion of either inclusive, exclusive, or inconclusive need to be made such that one cannot just report the LR without a conclusion?
I think I'll take a first stab at that one. Ultimately, the current guidelines for interpretation of autosomal DNA results, I believe they do mention that you've got 3 possible conclusions that can be drawn. One is inclusion, the other is exclusion, and the third would be inconclusive. That whole document really pertains to binary systems. There's places in that document that mention that, hey, probabilistic genotyping could better deal with some of those situations. And one of the things that the Autosomal Interpretation Committee is tasked with working on is incorporating probabilistic genotyping into those guidelines. But right now, the ones that currently exist mainly deal with binary systems.
All right. We'll ask one last question before we do move into our closing. So this one came in during Stephen's talk. So the recommendation for reporting out the lowest value rather than closest to 1 is because you recommend using the reciprocal of the LR for the verbal scale. Is that correct?
No, it's more, I think, focused on in general, not as an absolute rule, but in general, in the courtroom setting, the lowest LR tends to be beneficial to the defendant. Clearly, you can come up with examples where that's not necessarily true, but I think that was a guiding point there, was trying to, a lot of time has also been spent over the notion of what does it mean to say you're being conservative. But in the end, I think that was just part of the goal there, is that if you have any potential information that could, benefit the defendant, that it should be, if you're going to pick one way to go, it should go that direction.
And we didn't want the scenario where if you had a result of 0.001 and a result of 0.1, we didn't want to provide the less exclusionary result for the defendant. We felt that result would actually be the one that provides less support, but we felt that ultimately we would recommend providing the result that was favorable for the defendant.
All right. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, we are going to go ahead and move into our closing. Obviously, the first thing we would like to do is to thank all of our presenters and all of our subject matter experts for taking the time today. We would also like to thank everything that they have done for SWGDAM in general. They are definitely moving that working group forward, and that is great to see for the forensic science community. So thank you very much to our subject matter experts and presenters today. Obviously, we would also like to thank, as we always do, our audience for joining us today. This was a fantastic webinar with a lot of great questions. We had almost 500 attend today, and these webinars just would not be possible without your attendance and support. So thank you very much for joining us today. Before you leave today's webinar, we always ask that you participate in a short survey. You'll find there in the middle of your screen. Simply click the word "Here," and that will open up a new window for you, and you can go through that short customer experience survey for us that will allow us to either adjust the content or the way that we disseminate that content out to you, our audience. We do also, as I mentioned, on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, have a PDF version of today's slide deck. So go ahead and click on the title of that slide deck there, and then click the Download Files button directly below that. And that will go ahead and start that download for you. We will leave the room open for a few minutes so that you have a chance to get that downloaded. You will also see there in your chat pod, Julian is plugging some of our social media outlets, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, as well as our podcasts. We are currently moving into our 5th season of podcasts. So if you have not subscribed to that, it is a great thing to listen to whenever we get those out to you. We also have our website there that will direct you to all of our no-cost forensic webinars that we have put out through the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence. So be sure to check that out. As always, we are recording this webinar, and we will be turning it around into an archival version here in the near future. And with as fantastic as this webinar was, with as many great questions in the attendance, we might be offering a follow-up to this. Just check our website for more details on that if we are able to get a follow-up webinar on this topic. Again, thank you so much to our presenters today. Thank you to our audience members, and we hope everyone has a great rest of your afternoon.